2024 is coming to an end, so I thought we could take a look back at the entire year and see how many steps forwards or backwards the game took this year. It's important to have context though, because the biggest thing for me this year that was a positive step in the right direction has to be the season pass vehicles that we got. The reason this was a positive step though was purely because of how messed up the 2023 line was. 2023 gave us only tier 10s in the season passes, and it started with the Avery, which is still one of the most potent and overpowered tanks of all time. Then they gave us the Centauro from PC, but butchered it with a reverse auto reloader and a single shot gun option, but for some reason forgot that we give auto reloaders the gun rammer in this game, so the Centauro is the only auto reloader without the rammer option, from one OP tank to a heavily nerfed PC tank. Then back to OP tanks when we released the Murat and T58 Heavy. Both stupidly strong autoloaders with great penetration and characteristics that baffle me to this day. Why have we decided a heavy tank now gets tank destroyer levels of pen, and why does the Murat share the camo with the 30B? Regardless of these two tanks that some players may have forgotten about, I don't think anyone has forgotten about the Ruthless they released next. This was very annoying to see. Wargaming giving away a 183mm gun for cheap to all players. No grind necessary down the Death Star or Pooh Barn lines, just buy the season pass and bam, here's a 183mm gun with an E4's turret. Like what? What were we thinking? Luckily at the very end of 2023, they released the 114 SP2, which was the most balanced and fun tank to play of that year's lineup, but it was just a PC tank. Meanwhile, the 4 tanks that we made first, we released overpowered, and we butchered another PC tank. So it was nice to see a PC tank make its way over and just be good. And that leads us into 2024's Season Pass lineup. As the Battlefront season ended, we were hit with the Season of the Dragon, which gave us the Highlander, a skin version of the 116 F3, another PC tank. And it's a good tank, but has a really long reload that holds it back in the eyes of many, as it only has 3 rounds of the mag, so it cannot kill most things in just one mag. It's also another tier 10, so the trend was seemingly going to continue into 2024 of tier 10 premiums. But the next Tigers season would prove that assumption wrong, because alongside the release of the Tech Tree Japanese tank destroyers, we got the Ka-Ri, which is a tier 8 tank destroyer, finally a non-tier 10 tank. And it was a strong but not overpowered tank destroyer too. Decent camo and 500 alpha damage with enough armor to be comfortable with. It was a nice thing to see a tier 8 again from the season passes. No cheap tier 10 that time. And even the next season after that was also not a tier 10. It was a tier 9 though, and that was the TS60 from the Patriot season. This tank is pretty good, but unfortunately to me, if you have the AET60, then I see no reason to play the TS60. Which the AET60 was a tank released in 2023 as well, that's pretty damn overpowered. So that's kind of upsetting, but the TS60 is still a good tank, with a nice skin that had some character to it for once. Sadly though, the Ka-Ri and the TS60 were the only non-tier 10s from the season passes this year, but at least the next 3 aren't overpowered. The heavy metal season gave us the T114 Bat, which although it feels like an out-of-place Cold War tank shoehorned into World War II, it's at least a fun tank to play with trade-offs to its power. No premium ammo, but good standard heat rounds, no gun elevation and slow shell speeds, but nice clip potential and good HE, as well as acting as a potential scout when needed. It is quite strong, and to me is probably the strongest of 2024's Season Pass vehicles. Next, with the Darkness Rising season, we got the Canonian Jagdpanzer III GST Term, which is another tier 10 tank destroyer, and it's quite odd. It is really fast and has a thick but flat frontal armor. It is large and only does 400 alpha damage with initially poor DPM and low pen for a tier 10 tank destroyer with only 310 pen on its heat rounds. They did buff this one and thankfully gave it more HP and better DPM, but it's still quite low on the totem pole for tier 10 tank destroyers overall. It's by no means bad, which I was happy to see, as that made 5 non-OP premiums from the season passes this year. Which leads us to the 6th and final season pass tank of 2024, and that is the Chaug from the Frostbite season. This tier 10 Polish non-super heavy is quite fun to play and very interesting. My review for it will be the next video I post, so look for that if you want to know my thoughts, but real quick I can tell you it's not overpowered, but it is nice and strong. So for 2024, we can at least say that the season pass tanks were better this year compared to the previous year's lineup. Better as in they weren't ridiculous, with less tier 10s and no OP meta defining and meta changing tanks added through the season pass. Instead, those types of tanks will be released as standalones later in 2024. But before we get to that, let's go back to the beginning and see what all happened. Firstly, I want to say how happy I was to see all the Cold War changes that happened almost every season this year. We had the progression and economy changes at the beginning of the year that made the grinding much nicer and things cheaper, as well as reined in the silver urns to bring back a sense of silver grinding in World War II as a viable option. It's not perfect and could still be tweaked in parts, but it was nice to see in the first place. We also got changes to ramming mechanics so that super light tanks don't just bounce off like beach balls, but instead actually take ram damage from big tanks. And we got the removal of some heat rounds on some Era 2 and 3 tanks and replaced with HE or Hesh rounds, thanks to feedback from players frustrated with the uselessness heat rounds felt they had in those eras. There were some APFSDS round changes too that made them shatter, alongside some overmatch mechanic changes, on top of missile minimum arming distances added to prevent the power of close-up shotgunning with missiles. All these Cold War changes this year were pretty great, and I'm still waiting on bigger and better changes to be made to encourage players like myself to give Cold War another chance. But these were a good start and give me hope that one day we will fix all of the issues with Cold War's gameplay and make it feel like a well thought out mode that belongs in this game and not some tumor attached at the hip. This year was also WoT Console's 10th anniversary, so in February we had some special sales and goodies. But not only were we given our usual tier 3 with every anniversary, but we were given a tier 10 tank that was discounted depending on how long you had been playing, with players of 7 years or more of tenure netting the tank for completely free. This tank was the start of 420 alpha damage in our game as well, at least for tier 10 vehicles, and I have to clarify that before someone mentions the 53 TP having a 420 alpha gun first. But this was very cool of Wargaming to do for its 10 years. It gave players a nice reward for playing for a long time, and still gave players a discount too that didn't play for as long. I don't expect this trend to continue, however, with the upcoming 11-year anniversary, but we'll just have to wait and see about that. Later on, we then had the Tank Fest 2024, which was special this year as the Tank Museum had refurbished their 4005, so we had a special skin for the 4005 sold for that. But more importantly with this year's Tank Fest, we got a roadmap that told us a bit more than we usually get. That being that there'd be one more Cold War line released during the year at that point, and a time frame for when that would be. It's not much, but it was certainly more than we normally get. They also debuted what tanks we'd be getting from this year's celebration event. And quickly, if you don't know what that is, it's a year-long event that will reward you with 2 premium tanks depending on how many seasons you completed this year. If you didn't complete them all, well then you'll have discounts on your choice of tank. And there are 2 tanks, one Cold War and one World War II. And they were announced at Tank Fest to be the M42 Duster for World War II and the M163 VADS for Cold War. Looking back at this now, this definitely foreshadowed what was to come later in the year too, with anti-air and rotary autocannon tanks making their way into the game. We then got a special D-Day 80th anniversary event this year. There was a PvE mode that pitted 7 players against waves of bots with objectives to take and bosses to kill. It was actually pretty cool and had a reward structure alongside it that gave the Thunderbolt and some other goodies to those that played it. I actually really liked the mode and it felt like old war stories, but match made. And of course it showed us the potential for more of these events to happen later on. We also had a lot of collaborative events this year. We had the Dune collab with the release of Dune Part 2, where we got Commanders and the Wind of Arrakis tank introduced. There was also the Star Trek event that gave us a skinned AAT-60 for Cold War called the Emissary, as well as Commanders from the universe as well. Then there was the Metal Fest event with a bunch of new bands. There was Motorhead and Rob Zombie added, as well as the return of Metallica, Sabaton, and Iron Maiden tanks. Motorhead and Rob Zombie got their own unique tanks added, and even Commanders with special voiceovers that used an AI recreation of Lemmy, the singer of Motorhead, to make his voiceover. That was definitely an interesting thing to hear in-game. Speaking of returning IPs though, we also had the return of Warhammer and the release of the Rogel Dorn this year, which is an insanely powerful super heavy with 2 good-ass gun options. They even gave us a community event that let us pick a side and earn a free Warhammer tank too, depending on which side we picked. That's already a lot of collabs, but one more returned with the Girls in Panzer with a free way to earn the GUP tank as well. So overall we had 5 collaborative events this year. We then had Extra Life and raised a bunch of money for charity, and had a lot of fun with the devs in the Halloween event mode that was still running at the time, with them even playing tanks to help those out who were hunting for a special Garage Gear trophy for killing all the different monster tanks in the game, which was a hard task to complete. And that leads us to the end with Winterfest, which brought back toy tanks with 4 more tanks on the roster, the flamethrower, autocannon, tank destroyer, and missile toy tanks, as well as a new boost ability and a bigger map. Toy tank mode this year was honestly the most fun I've had in the mode since its inception. It really did feel like a massive improvement, but sadly, we only had 1 week to play it, as the rest of this event we had another PvE mode with 2 different stages. We had to turn on the lights in the city and kill some Yetis in the first one, and now we have to take out the Ice Queen herself in the second. This mode is neat and all, but it does have its annoyances, most importantly the caps, which were done a lot better in the D-Day mode in my eyes, as well as being able to play and grind out real tanks in that D-Day event mode, while this one you can only grind commanders as you have to play with the toy tanks. It's a really neat idea though, and I hope to continue to do more of these as a nice break of pace from the constant PvP, for those who want more from AI battles than just a multiplayer simulation in the co-op mode. I think it'd be neat if we made co-op into these types of missions with players rather than just simulating multiplayer battles, but that's a whole other video topic in itself that I will do eventually. This event wasn't just the toy tank modes, however, it was more than that, with a whole new event exclusive currency to use inside of the Winterfest storefront with new tanks and commanders and other goodies to purchase with your snowballs. It's honestly really cool and a nice event for this year's Christmas time, but something more sinister was released within this event that's impossible to ignore. Gambling. We finally did it after 10 years of the game. We've gone and launched a brand new tank behind gambling, and in a way I didn't even think was possible, and yet here we are. This whole Winterfest event ruined by the overlooming gambling we introduced for holiday cheers. It's definitely the most upsetting thing to happen this year, and it happened right at the end. Things were looking so good up until the last 3 months. But the Winterfest event was only this last month. So what do I mean when I say the last 3 months? Well, October was the start of a bad end of the year when they released the insanely overpowered 4K DPM rocket tank with great armor and mobility called the Night Stalker. This tank is actually insane and cannot be forgotten. And the only reason I fear it might be forgotten is because more OP tanks released afterwards, with November and the black tanks giving us the Vigilante T249. An anti-air disguised as the best light tank in the game with the best camo and 410 meters view range on top of its insane 4,800 potential clip damage in less than just 4 seconds. It's just absurd. And we all know these tanks are absurd, and I don't want to harp on them too much as I've made dedicated reviews and videos talking about these tanks and the gambling itself. So if you don't know about these tanks or how bad the gambling is, go check those videos out for a clearer picture on all of it. It's important to note the Grom here too, with its lack of mechanic and insane power because of it. But it's a tier 8 released between 2 uber powerful tier 9 and 10 premiums, so it's mostly swept under the rug too. What makes it worse too in my eyes is that the year was going so well, and then at the end we released 3 overpowered tanks and gambling to a degree that I just cannot believe. It really is just tragic. So with all that being said, how was 2024? Well, it was looking like it was all upwards in terms of the direction of the game from the beginning of the year and throughout. But right at the end, they tainted this year with OP tanks and gambling, which is a big stain on the game in my opinion. And nothing will wash out that gambling stain except an actual big change and acknowledgement of the gambling they introduced, but we all know that's not going to happen. Like I said, we had such a good start. 10 years of the game, no OP season pass tanks, multiple good Cold War changes, cool PvE events, 5 different collabs, both new and returning, Tank Fest and the Celebrations event, Extra Life, Halloween mode, Toy Tank mode, the Winterfest event aside from gambling, and I didn't even mention the 4 tech tree lines we got this year and all the new maps. All of that is great, and exciting too, especially with the Cold War changes. We even nerfed some tanks finally, but still no premium tank nerfs. And those are desperately needed, especially with the new added power, and again, the gambling just taints it all. It's hard for me to say this year was good when we're ending on gambling. But if I somehow ignore a big issue like that, then this has been one of the better years post 6.0 that we've gotten. The season pass tanks are the biggest thing for me. That's a huge step in the right direction. But overpowered tanks still existed this year outside of the pass and aren't getting nerfed. So until we see some premium tank nerfs, I don't think we'll ever have a perfect year, since all they seem to do is power creep those overpowered tanks with more unexpectedly overpowered trash. And the Night Stalker and the Vigilante definitely did not help with that this year. I'd give this year probably 2.5 out of 5 stars. It's impossible to ignore the positives we got with those season pass tanks and Cold War changes, as well as all the neat stuff in between. But a whole star has to be taken away for gambling, and a whole other one for the overpowered tanks added. And the half? Well, because we still won't nerf any premiums. I was enjoying this year of tanks right up until the end. Let me know though how you feel about this year, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.